Azure ARM Emulator layer Android.
Hi everyone, and thanks for watching laurieWIRED. So today I'm going to show you how you can run an ARM Android emulator on an Azure virtual machine in the cloud. So this is useful if you have an APK that only supports ARM, but your host is not ARM-based, and maybe you have a real device, but you don't want to use it, or you don't have a real device to use. So this is going to be one of your only options if you're trying to run an ARM-based APK. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new virtual machine in Azure. I'm going to install Docker and then run an emulator that's ARM64 based. And then finally, I'm going to show you a trick for how you can connect to the screen of the Android emulator running in Azure on your local machine. So first things first, let's go ahead and pull up Azure. So I'm going to create a new resource. And this is going to be my virtual machine. And I'm going to create a new resource group for it. And we'll call this ARM VM test. And this is going to be the resource group that the virtual machine that I'm created is associated with. It doesn't really matter what you name it, anything you want. And then let's give our ARM virtual machine a name. I'm going to call this ARM VM. And you can pick the region that you want. Pretty much, if you want, all the defaults are going to be fine for this, except the image type and VM architecture. So I'm going to pick Ubuntu Server 20.04, since this has some ARM options. So you can see for the VM architecture, normally x64 is auto-selected, but we want to make sure that we select ARM64 since we're going to be emulating an ARM Android emulator. So if we do this, it means that the processor architecture of the machine that's going to be running the emulator matches or is backwards compatible with the emulator itself, so the performance is going to be pretty good. And we can pick the size for our VM. We should be fine with 2 virtual CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. That should be plenty for the emulator and maybe some additional software that we want to be running on it. And this is one of the cheaper options. So I'll select that. And you can use a key pair and you can store that in Azure, but I'm just going to go ahead and use a password. And I'll give my virtual machine a username that I'm going to log in with. I'll just call this Azure User 1. And now I need to give it a password. And we want to make sure that we leave SSH port 22 open so that we can actually connect to our virtual machine. So one thing about this, I'm using Ubuntu Server, so you can install an RDP client, so XRDP here, but I'm just going to be connecting to this via the command line, and I'm going to make sure that port 22 is open so that we can actually connect to it. And pretty much all the other defaults are going to be just fine, so I'm going to go quickly through this. It's creating a new virtual network for my machine and allocating it a new IP address. And we see port 22 is open. These are fine. Okay, so now we're reviewing and creating, and you can see that it's actually pretty cheap to run this virtual machine. This is going to be 8 cents per hour for the particular size and architecture that we chose. So these are all the settings that we gave our VM. Reviewing, it looks good. And I'm going to go ahead and create my new virtual machine. So now it's going to start deploying the virtual machine inside of Azure. So this might take a few minutes to complete its process. All right, so now it looks like our VM has been deployed successfully, so I'm going to take a look at my deployment. So we can just connect to it. We'll hit connect, SSH, and this is going to give us the command to connect to our virtual machine via SSH. So I'm going to copy this and open up PowerShell to connect to our virtual machine. Okay, I'll paste that command. And since I'm logging in with a password instead of a key pair, I'm going to get rid of that and can connect right here. Yes. Now I'm typing in my password. All right, and you can see we've successfully connected to our Azure virtual machine. So now we've created that resource, we want to install Docker and be able to run the Android emulator from here, but there's a few things we need to run first to get that set up. So I'm going to go to the Docker documents and show how we can install Docker from scratch on just a brand new VM. So I'm going to skip this because this is a clean VM. I have no other installations on here. And apt-get, this is when we're running the package manager for Ubuntu. So for most of these commands, feel free to just copy and paste. I'll type in a few of them just to show you an example. So I will go sudo apt-get update. And I will copy the next command while that's updating. And then these are going to be all the packages that we're needing to install for Docker. That finished, so paste. That looks good. Add Docker's GPG key. We can really just copy and paste all this. I won't spend too much time explaining since we just copy paste to install Docker. Now we'll update our package manager one more time. So we have all the Docker repositories available to us to download Docker from. So it looks like I forgot to add the repositories. I think here we go. So we'll paste that and try that one more time. And sudo apt-get update. That looks good. And then we'll try this command one more time. Paste. There we go, that's what we wanted. So now it's installing all of the different Docker packages, so we will be able to run our Android emulator inside of Docker. All right, so it looked like our Docker installation was successful. Now we'll try and run the Hello World container just to make sure that it ran fully. So we'll do sudo docker run hello-world. And so it's pulling the Hello World image from Docker Hub right there. And if you see this hello from Docker right here, it means that your Docker installation was successful. One thing to note, if you noticed when I ran this command, I had to run it as root, and that can get kind of tedious if you're having to run sudo docker for every single different Docker command that you're trying to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow Docker to be run without sudo. So I have a couple commands up here for this whole installation process, and I will share this online with everybody watching this video, so you can just copy and paste these commands, but I'll go ahead and write them out. So what we need to do to run Docker without sudo, we need to do sudo group add Docker. Looks like we already have that group, and we will do sudo usermod -ag docker, and then we're going to print out the current user. So that's just really going to be my Azure user 1 right here. This is just going to print that out. So enter that. So now we will be able to run Docker without sudo, but we need to reboot first to make these changes take effect. So I'm going to run sudo reboot now, and this is going to reboot my Azure virtual machine. So I'm going to give this a little bit to come back online, and then I'll reconnect to it. I'll be able to run Docker without sudo. All right, so I think that's been enough time, and I'm going to use that same PowerShell command for SSH to connect to my virtual machine one more time. So do our password. And looks good. So let's try that one more time. Docker run hello-world. And perfect. Now we didn't need to use sudo this time. Okay, so now we have Docker installed on our virtual machine, and we're gonna run our emulator very shortly. But what I wanna do first is I wanna install ADB on this virtual machine so that I can connect to the emulator that's running. So what we need to do here is we just need to install it via our Ubuntu package manager. So we're gonna do sudo apt get install an Android tools, since ADB is part of the Android toolset, -ADB. Yes, we want to install it. And it's installing it for our ARM64 architecture on our host. And we'll let that finish up. Looks good. Now, if we run ADB, perfect. You should be able to see something like this, the help commands for ADB. Okay, so we have ADB installed, and now all we need to do is turn on our emulator. So we're going to use this REdroid, which has a few ARM64 versions of Android emulators available to us. And so we're just going to use this, but feel free to use any ARM-based emulator of your choice. So first thing to note is there are a couple kernel modules that you need to install on this before you'll be able to run the emulator. So make sure that you run these commands or the emulator isn't going to start up properly. So first thing, let's do this. Sudo apt install. And this is this uname-r, it's installing for our current kernel. So we'll let that finish up right there. All right, so now we have installed our kernel modules. There's a couple more commands that we need to run, and we're just gonna copy and paste them. Paste, and oh, I need to run this as sudo. So we'll copy them one by one. Sudo mod probe, and run the second one. Copy, sudo mod probe. Just an FYI that these commands are not persistent. You can go and add these to your kernel modules, but if not, then you need to run these every time you reboot the virtual machine. So I'm just gonna run these for right now, just one time. But now we have the required kernel modules installed, so we should be able to just go ahead and run our emulator. So I have the command written out for us. So I'll pull it up here. And again, I'm going to make all of these available for you to copy and paste as well. So I will just copy this for running the emulator. And then this is just our REdroid emulator, remember. And we'll paste, and we'll go through this just command by command. So Docker run, we're running a new container, and we're running it in the background. And then we're running a privileged container. And we're giving that container the name Android Emu. I like that because when I kill and remove the container, I can specify it by name rather than the unique ID that's generated for the container every time a new container runs. So if I wanted to script this up, this -name option is really useful. And then we're mounting a volume from the host to the container in our home data directory and mounting that to the /data directory on the device itself. And we're also mapping over port 5555, since this is the port that the emulator is going to be running on, that ADB is going to be connecting to. And then this, of course, is the image name that we're going to be pulling. So this is pulling down the latest REdroid image from Docker Hub. They had a few different versions up there, so you can pick the version that you prefer, but I'm just going with Android 11 right here. And so this is going to be downloading all of the different image layers required for the container. All right, so it looks like our container has finished downloading and running. So it doesn't look like anything's happened, but this is running in the background. So we'll do Docker PS, and you can see we're running right here. So we can verify that the emulator is working by connecting to it via ADB on this Azure virtual machine. We'll do ADB devices. And our ADB server was not running, so now it's going to start up, and it looks like it found the device. However, if it didn't find the device, all I need to do is run ADB connect localhost port 5555. But mine's already connected, so I won't run this. Okay, so we can see that it's set to device. If this was set to offline, you might need to give it a little bit more time to boot up completely. Or if you're running this and it's not connecting properly, maybe you didn't run those kernel module commands that you needed to run before. So try running those again and then restarting the container. So we've now connected to the device and we can see that we're connecting to it inside of our Azure virtual machine. But since we're only connected via SSH, and what if I want to connect to the GUI interface of the actual Android device? Well, there is a way we can connect to this locally using SSH tunneling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using Scrcpy, which you can download onto your current host machine, not the Azure machine, your host that you're running on, and you can download one of the latest releases for whatever operating system you're running on. I have already downloaded this for 64-bit Windows, so I'm just going to open up a terminal here. Okay, put this over here. And just to show I don't have any devices connected, I'm going to run ADB devices, and FYI, I already have ADB installed on my host machine, so make sure that you install that first before following along here. And so now I want to actually be able to connect to the remote emulator that's running on my Azure virtual machine. So let me go back to my PowerShell window, open up a new prompt, and we're going to use SSH tunneling. So what this is going to do is it's going to take that port that's running on the Azure virtual machine, and it's going to let us on our host machine connect to that emulator port. So the command to do that is SSH-L, and then it's going to be port number, and then our local host. And then we're doing the same port for the remote machine and the local machine. And then it's going to be our remote Azure virtual machine credentials. So it's Azure user 1 at, copy in my IP address, put in my password, all right. So we didn't have any devices connected before, and now that we've done our SSH tunneling command, we should be able to connect to the remote emulator now. So all I need to do is run ADB connect 127.0.0.1 for localhost. Then 5555 was the port that the emulator is running on. And that is the same port that we forwarded or tunneled to our host machine. And it looks like we have a connection. Perfect. So you might be thinking, well, how do I know that I'm actually connected to the emulator that's currently running in Azure? Let me prove it to you. So I'm going to get a shell to the device. I'm going to go to the SD card directory, look at ls right here, and you can see these are all the directories that I currently have. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to my PowerShell, and I'll just go back to my original one. And I'm going to get a shell to the device on this Azure machine and create a new file and then verify on my host machine that that file does indeed exist. So I'll do ADB shell. Let's go to the same directory, and we'll just create a new file right here. Put this over here so you can all see. Okay, ls, that looks nice. We'll do touch to create a new file, test1 ls. So you can see that new file is created here, and this is on our Azure virtual machine connected to our emulator running in Docker. Let me go to our host. So this is our host machine just running CMD. And we didn't have that file before. So ls, there it is, test1. So we can verify that this is indeed the emulator. Also, you can see it's ARM64 and my host is x64 based, so it wouldn't be running this fast if this was running on my local machine. So now the next really cool thing is we're going to be using Scrcpy, which uses the ADB connection to the emulator, so we don't have to forward or tunnel any more ports to the virtual machine. All we need to do is run it. So I'm going to do exit, and I'm already inside of my Scrcpy directory, which I downloaded. I'm going to show you here. We're going to be running this Scrcpy executable right here. I'm going to run the Scrcpy, and then -s to connect to the device. And our device name was this, which was just localhost and the port 5555. Make sure that you're listing the device name that's listed under ADB devices and not something else. So you can just copy and paste this. And there you have it. You can see that we now have our device open, and if we want to, we can play with the UI as much as we want and interact with any apps that are installed on here. And it looks like the speed is pretty good. That's very nice. All right. So additionally, if we wanted to, since we're already connected to the device via ADB, we could install packages, any APKs we want, send any different ADB commands, and now we also have the device UI to interact with as well. So that is how we can run an ARM-based Android emulator, even if we don't have an ARM machine available to us. We can just run this completely in Azure and then connect to our remote machine. So I'm going to close this out now, get rid of this, and all we need to do is exit here, and I'll exit all of my connections. And if it hangs like this, it means you need to kill the ADB server because that port is still in use. So I will do ADB kill server and close that. And now you can see it closed now. And we can get rid of that. And final step, so that we're not wasting any money, is we can go to the machine and we want to make sure we stop it, because if you remember, it gave us a price for running that per hour. So if you leave this on, it's going to keep on charging you that price for as long as you run this virtual machine for. So we'll just hit the stop button. So if it's stopped, you're only paying for the other resources, such as like the virtual network, the IP, and you're paying for the OS disk that is being stored. If you don't want to pay anything, you can go inside of your Azure resources and delete all of those resources if you wanted to run this every time. But this way, since I still have the VM available, all I need to do is start the VM again if I want to connect to it one more time and not rerun all of those previous commands. Alright, so thanks so much for watching laurieWIRED. Today, we showed how we could run an ARM-based Android emulator inside of a virtual machine that was also ARM-based inside of Azure. We also showed how we could install ADB and Docker and run the emulator through Docker. And finally, we showed how we could use SSH tunneling so that we could connect a local instance of ADB to our remote emulator, and also use Scrcpy to interact with the user interface of the device. So thanks so much for watching laurieWIRED, and I'll see you in the next video.